Good evening, Western Standard viewers, and welcome to Hannaford. Now that former President Trump seems likely to be leading the U.S. for a second term, Canada's left-wing government, bought and paid for media are just excoriating the man, and quite a hateful diatribe coming out from all of them. A frenzy of scorn and hatred. In fact, they are predicting that a second Trump presidency would be terrible for Canada as Trump tries to make America great again at Canada's expense. But is that really how it's going to be? With me today is political economist, author, and founder of Ottawa's leading public policy think tank, economist, author, Brian Lee Crowley. Brian, welcome to the show.
Nigel, it's lovely to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Brian, you founded the Macdonald-Laurier Institute 14 years ago to examine questions like this. So let's talk about three things. First, is it even going to be Trump? A lot has happened in the last 2 weeks with the assassination, with Biden removing himself from the nomination process, this apparent coronation of Kamala Harris, aided and abetted by an obviously partisan mainstream media in the United States. So maybe it isn't going to be Trump. I'm going to ask you what your feelings are about that. The second thing is, if it is Trump, is it so bad? You have a special perch. You have an office in Washington as part of the Economic Institute. What do you observe about that? And then thirdly, would a Harris administration be any better? Brian, let's start. Is it going to be Trump?
Excellent question, Nigel. 2 weeks ago, I would have been willing to bet serious money that Donald Trump was going to be president after November. I'm not saying that he's not going to be president, but I just think the balance of probability has shifted. You mentioned all the events that have happened in the last couple of weeks. I think they have shaken up the political scene in a way that could not have been foreseen even just a very short while ago. And as a result, I think, for example, many Americans assumed that the choice they had was between Biden and Trump. And clearly, if that was the choice, they were going to vote Trump. I don't think there was any doubt about it. But at the same time, many Americans were saying, but we're not very happy with that choice. And indeed, Nikki Haley, one of the candidates for the Republican nomination, had said early on in her campaign that the party that moved on from Trump and Biden first would be the one that would carry the day in the presidential election. And I think there's some truth to that. I think there are a lot of people who are saying, okay, now that the choice is different than what I thought it was going to be, I'm going to reevaluate. That doesn't necessarily mean that the choice they will come to will be, then it's going to be Harris. I was going to vote for Trump, but no more. I was quite struck by quite a prominent American pollster who said the other day, that Kamala Harris was enjoying a bit of a honeymoon. She's a newly minted candidate, and as you say, the mainstream media were covering her with praise and trying to obscure some of the less savory parts of her political record. And this pollster said, today, i.e., the first day of her coronation as the Democratic Party candidate, is going to be the best day of her campaign. It's going to be all downhill from here because there's going to be a huge effort, of course, on the part of the Republicans to bring out that political record of which Harris might not be necessarily so proud and not wanting to put it in the window as she runs for president.
So, Brian, why does American business like the Democrat Party so much? Surely the Democrats are the party of the blue-collar unions, and the Republicans should be the party of big business. Isn't that what we've always understood?
Well, it's certainly been the traditional positioning of the two parties, that the Republicans were the party of business. They, were often criticized by the Democrats for lowering taxes and privileging the rich. That they were country club Republicans. I think this is completely in the past now. Trump and his vice president J.D. Vance, his vice presidential candidate, I should say, J.D. Vance, have worked very hard to reposition the Republican Party as essentially a blue-collar party of traditional American values, as opposed to the Democrats, who have become, culture warriors. They're the people who are pushing the diversity, inclusion, equity agenda, the transsexual agenda, in my view, the corruption of universities, the dragging them to the left, the exclusion of a whole range of opinion from respectable positions within the universities. And so you have, I think, a wide range of institutions which have been taken over by Democratic-leaning groups, not because of economic issues, but because of cultural issues. And I would say that these cultural issues are now the fundamental divide between Democrats and Republicans. Republicans, for example, want to portray themselves as the party of the rule of law, whereas the Democrats want to say, oh, well, stop talking about illegal immigrants because they're really only irregular, and we're going to have a path to citizenship for them, even though they weren't invited into the country and are here under false pretenses, et cetera, et cetera. These are now the issues that divide the parties. And
now that actually leads right on to whether Trump is going to be good for Canada. The people that Trump represents are essentially people who would like to be working at well-paying jobs in their home states, in their hometowns. That was how things were 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Those jobs have been exported. So they are very interested in economic development. Is Trump going to make America great again at Canada's expense?
Well, I think that Trump is definitely going to be excellent, assuming he wins, at doing something that he did in the first term, which was to make people believe that he is an absolutely crazy man who is going to do crazy things. And anybody who's read his book, The Art of the Deal, which I commend to people, he is completely open about his negotiating tactics. And basically, he says the way to win, to get the deal you want, is to go into the room and scare the pants off people, make them think you're the craziest guy in the room. And if you don't get what you want, you're going to blow everything up. But this is, in my experience of Trump, this is a negotiating tactic. This does not actually represent his actual feelings or objectives in his negotiations. So let's take the example of the last renegotiation of NAFTA, which became CUSMA, the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement for continental free trade. Trump said, NAFTA, worst trade deal in American history. It sold American workers down the river. I mean, he couldn't say enough terrible things about NAFTA. And he scared the Mexicans and the Canadians into thinking that he was going to put everything on the line, that, he'd walk away from free trade. And of course, that would be disastrous for Canada. There's no doubt about it. Now, if you actually examine the agreement that came out of that negotiation, if you put the NAFTA agreement and CUSMA side by side, you would be kind of hard pressed to say that one was damaging to Canada's interests, whereas the other promoted Canada's interests. I
Well,
think,
Brian, I mean, let's remember in 2018, he imposed a tariff on Canadian aluminium. Obviously, that's damaging to Canadian manufacturers of aluminium. How far can I understand that the industries are actually very integrated. One motor car chassis probably goes back and forwards over the US-Canada border more than once before the car is finally complete and exported. But there are some obstacles to being America first, but that's pretty much his mindset, isn't it?
well, I think again, I would make the case that he talks a good game. He is very liberal with threats. He will make you think if you don't do exactly what he wants, he's going to slap 20% or 30% or 50% or whatever his number is on imports from your country, and then you're really going to be in terrible shape. My experience of watching him carry out these negotiations is he actually, if you can dig in behind this kind of positioning before negotiations get underway, he actually is looking for a rather more balanced outcome than a lot of people think. He understands that America is damaged by excessive aggressiveness with trade partners and so on. He has been very successful at renegotiating many trade agreements, and in seeing that Canada, pulls in its horns on things like supply management and so on, which, in my view, more power to Trump. I hope he puts the boots to supply management in the next round of trade negotiations with Canada, because supply management isn't in Canada's interest.
Yeah, but this $10 a pound butter is killing us.
Well, exactly, and getting access to cheaper American dairy products is in Canada's interest. I've never understood why political parties in Canada think that it's a losing proposition to campaign on the idea of low food prices for Canadians. But be that as it may, Trump, remember that Trump, even if he wanted to, Trump has to get trade agreements adopted by Congress. He is constrained in many ways in what he can do. And he will not have a free hand. He understands that the world is more complicated than make America great again. He's going to seek to rally Americans behind a broad program. He's going to want to get his allies on side against China. There are a whole series of ways in which he does not have the freedom of movement that his aggressive rhetoric suggests.
Now, okay, let's move to the third point, Brian, and that is whether Harris would be any better. The Democratic Party does not, to my observation, seem to have much of a tradition of free trade. Bernie Sanders certainly, Bernie Sanders didn't go anywhere, but he represents a strand of American Democratic Party thinking that was actually quite against free trade with Canada, with Mexico, with anyone. Trump, at least, seems to have doesn't seem to be in favor of global free trade agreements, but he's very happy with bilateral ones. But how would you, and I'm thinking here of your Washington office, what do you observe from that viewpoint about how Harris would feel about it, and what would she do about it?
Yes, well, it's certainly true that the Republicans were for many years the party of free trade, but it's also true that the Democrats were prepared to defend free trade. I mean, there was a bit of a Washington consensus, as it was called, for many years. You remember that Bill Clinton, who beat George W. Bush's father, George H.W. Bush, for the presidency, Bush Sr., who had negotiated NAFTA and seen it successfully implemented. Clinton did nothing to interfere with that. And in fact, when the kind of blue collar voters that we're talking about used to complain to Clinton about, how free trade was damaging their economic prospects. You remember he would famously say, "I feel your pain." So, he was empathetic to the problem, but he wasn't prepared to do anything to undermine free trade. So what we have now is both the Democrats and the Republicans rather skeptical about free trade. The Democrats like to sugarcoat it a little more. But remember that the swing states on which the presidency hinges are full of exactly the kind of people that were thrown out of jobs, at least according to the stories that Americans tell themselves, by free trade. We're talking about Pennsylvania, we're talking about Ohio, we're talking about Michigan. These are places that are full of these blue collar workers who used to get, good union wages at regular jobs, and in the last 20 years have found their economic prospects deeply damaged. And the great appeal of Trump to those voters is that he says, you were sacrificed in the interests of elites on the coasts in the United States who, love to buy Japanese cars and take their holidays in Europe. These are just not the preoccupations of blue collar workers in Pennsylvania and Michigan. So,
by the way, is that a valid analysis?
Is what a valid analysis?
Well, that the blue collar workers were sacrificed for the interests of an American elite. I mean, that's basically the Trump message. So, is that a fair examination of what happened in the last? Well, since China joined the World Trade Organization in 1999, 2000 or something?
Well, you see, I think that it's interesting. One of the few things on which there is a consensus in Washington across the aisle between the political parties is that China has not been a good faith player in the international trading system. And in fact, China is to be distrusted on a whole series of fronts. I think that the conclusion that people in both parties have come to is that the free trade movement, the principles behind free trade are still defensible. I believe in free trade, but that China doesn't play by the free trade rules. China pursues its national interest through the openness of Western institutions. Why is it that China has seized control of the critical minerals industry so that all of the minerals on which the so-called green economy depends to make solar panels and windmills and EV batteries and so on, all of these things are controlled by China to an unbelievable extent. They have far greater control over these highly valuable minerals than OPEC has over the oil industry, for example. And China has used the opening up of the trade system to invest money in American and other companies, not to be an owner and provide goods and services through these companies to Americans, but rather to plunder them for their technology, move it to China, and essentially shut down the American companies that were at the origin of this important intellectual capital and so on. So China is really, I think, the driver behind a lot of what's happened in the United States in terms of the falling reputation of free trade. I don't think that America and certainly not Congress thinks that Canada is responsible for the poor conditions of blue collar workers in the Rust Belt. There is increasingly talk in the United States about things like friendshoring. So, in other words, saying, okay, we don't want to be dealing with China. We don't want our standard of living to depend on raising China's economic status in the world. So if we're not buying from China, let's buy from our friends. And so there's a lot of positioning to get a lot of manufacturing and other economic activity into the hands of not just the United States, but also its friends in the Western Alliance.
So, Brian, let me ask you this. You said that there were constraints upon what Trump could and couldn't do. Presumably, those same constraints would operate on a Harris presidency, if that's in fact what turns out to be. That being so, and what you have just said about the underlying conflict over trade with China, does it really make an awful lot of difference to Canadians who occupies the White House from the point of view of trade only?
I actually don't think it does. And I think
all these people who are pouring contempt on Trump and trying to elevate Harris, I mean, they may have their reasons for doing so, but it's not actually contributing terribly much to the debate.
No, I think this idea that a Democratic administration in Washington is heaven and a Trump administration is hell is completely overblown. I'm not saying that there won't be specific issues on which Trump might be an unpleasant negotiating partner, but I think the reverse is also true. The Democrats, if they want to burnish their credentials on the border, might well come after the Canadian border, where there's a lot of concern about Canada's inability to guarantee American security. So I'm pretty sure that Canada's position will be pretty much the same under either a Trump or a Harris administration from a trade point of view. There will be lots of other things where those two administrations would do things differently, but trade with Canada wouldn't be high on their list.
Okay, Brian, that's great. Look, just tell us quickly about your Washington operation, what you're trying to achieve down there, and how that might influence matters back here in Canada.
Well, my view is that Canadians think they understand Americans. Nobody in the world understands Americans better than Canadians. I think this is some kind of metaphysical conceit. I think this is not true. I think we have an image of what Americans are like, but that image isn't always real. And I thought that the fact that in the entire think tank community in Canada, there wasn't one that had an office in Washington plugging into the American political system, the administration, the judicial system, and really dealing face to face with Americans, so that we weren't talking Canadians to Canadians, oh yes, we understand Americans, but actually talking to Americans and saying, what do you think about these issues that possibly divide Canadians and Americans? And I'm here to tell you that the problem that Canada has in Washington is that Washington is the world superpower. They care about everything, and every problem that arises in the world has an American dimension. And if there are 100 problems that Washington is wrestling with right now, Afghanistan, Iran, North Korea, the list goes on and on. Canada doesn't make the list of top 100 problems. We're friends, we share a continent, we're not military adversaries. So America just can't devote the kind of attention to Canada that Canadians think it should. And I think the only way for Canada to get America's attention for Canadian problems is to demonstrate to Americans that we think about their problems. You know, the only way to get the attention of Americans is to show up in their offices and not say, I need this from you, but to show up and say, you know, you have problems, X, Y, Z. You've got problems in the Caribbean. You've got problems with China. You've got problems in the Middle East. Here's how we can help solve those problems. And by the way, if you would like our help, there's a couple of things we would like in return. That's the only way. You know, Washington is a terribly transactional town. You got to have something to offer if you want something in return. And I think Canadians have never understood that. I think the number of times that Canada shows up and sort of wrings its hands is, oh, you know, why are you so mean to us? We're your best friends. This is completely useless in dealing with Americans. So,
you know, Brian, I know you've got good inroads into the into government and opposition both, perhaps more with the opposition. I hope that this message that you're offering today is getting through, because I'm not sure that we've seen an awful lot over the last 9 years of Canada going and saying, this is what we have to offer. This has been great. A lot has happened in the last 14 days. We've got 100 days before the election. I think we're going to be wanting to talk to you again, Brian, as the story develops.
I think there will be lots to talk about in the next 100 days, Nigel.
You bet. That's the Center for, in Washington, that's the Center for North American
Prosperity and Security. We call it
Prosperity and Security, and in Canada, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. You're Brian Lee Crowley. You're a busy man. Thank you for giving us this time. All the best.
Great to talk to you.
For the Western Standard, I'm Nigel Hannaford.